A few years ago, I came home from work to find my girlfriend sitting on the couch with a glum look on her face. When I asked her what the matter was, she gave me that fateful line, "We need to talk." She told me she wasn't happy in our relationship anymore and that she thought that we should take a break to see other people, essentially so we could decide if we really were supposed to be together. I really didn't want to, but I loved her enough to respect her decision, and I agreed. I thought if I at least gave her idea a try, I'd eventually win her back, but a few weeks later our relationship was well and truly over, and I had to move out of the apartment that we shared. Since it was technically her apartment first, obviously I had to find a new place to live, and fast. So I definitely didn't take all the time I should have to find somewhere decent, and I ended up paying for it pretty badly. The place I ended up renting was a one-room studio apartment in a building that straight up looked like a haunted house. I mean, that probably should have been a warning right there, but it was cheap, available, and the landlord only wanted a month's rent in advance to exchange for the keys. Plus, there was absolutely no way I was about to move back in with my mom and dad. Like, they'd be nice enough to offer, but it would have felt like way too much like a step back, and so I opted for the studio. Moving in was easy enough. I didn't have all that much in the way of possessions to take with me, and honestly, I just couldn't be bothered arguing with my then ex-girlfriend about who was entitled to what. The whole thing had been unpleasant enough without souring the broken relationship even further with petty arguments over furniture. Besides, as long as I had my Xbox and my 4K telly, I'd be happy enough. So the day after I move in, I knock at the flat across the hall from me to introduce myself to my neighbor. There was this thumping bass beat coming from the other side, so I knew someone was home, but when they answered, I was pretty shocked at how frank and unfriendly they were. The guy was quite young, with thick dark beard and a Cockney accent, and he didn't open the door the whole way. He just opened like a little crack before peering out. I introduced myself, told him I moved in across the hallway from him, and added that if he ever needed to borrow a cup of sugar or anything, he knew where to find me. But all I got in return was this cold, nervous stare. I figured I might have interrupted him in something, so I apologized and added that my name was Ollie. He replied, telling me his name was Jack. I know this sounds mad, but I got the distinct impression it was a name that he just plucked out of the air. Just something in my gut told me that, as weird as this sounds, and that he just made it up on the spot. But I'm not really the paranoid type, so I just put it down to him being a generally awkward person or whatever before I disappeared back into my flat. A few weeks later, I was just leaving my flat to head off to work when I saw a guy leaving Jack's flat. I wished him a good morning, and he wished me the same, and I followed up by asking him if he was one of Jack's friends or his flatmate or something. "Who?" he replies. It was then that I smelled the alcohol in his breath. I repeated the question, pointing towards the door of the flat and reiterating that it was Jack's flat. Yeah, I'm Jack's mate," he said, before continuing down the stairs and out the front door. Now this one I definitely knew was a lie, and it was that which clued me into the fact that the original guy had been lying to me too. Something weird was going on with that flat, but just exactly what it was I couldn't possibly imagine at that stage. So, this keeps happening for about a fortnight longer, with me catching different people going in and out of the flat across the hallway at all hours of the night. So when the landlord calls to pick up the next month's rent, I bring up the tenants from across the hall and ask him exactly who it is that lives there. He racks his brain for a moment, finally coming up with the name Stephen as the name of the tenant, adding that he's the best tenant he's ever had, how there are no noise complaints, how he always pays the rent on time and on the first day of every month via a direct debit deposit into his bank account. I was on the verge of telling him all about the different people I'd seen, but it wasn't really any of my business, was it? I mean, yeah, it was probably something a bit dodgy going on over there, but as long as no one was getting hurt, what did it have to do with me? I'm not a grass, so I've never been. It's just not my nature, so I kept my gob shut, even though in time I'd really, really wish that I hadn't. About a week later, I was asleep in bed when something woke me up, a sound coming from outside my flat. It was of heavy footfalls on the stairs, and somehow I knew it was something to do with the flat across the hall. As I lay there all blurry-eyed, I finally decided that I was going to put a complaint into the landlord, but was nearly scared out of my skin when I heard a series of loud bangs on the front of my flat. "Merseyside Police! Open the door, or we smash it in!" My heart began to race, so hard that I could actually hear it pumping in my ears. I was frozen to the spot for a moment, and it took another few bangs and another shot before I could even get my head together. I ran to the threshold, pulling back the mortise lock before opening up the door. The next thing I know, there's a torch in my face, completely blinding me as a pair of armed, tactically dressed policemen storm into my flat and throw me to the ground. "Hands behind your back! Move and you're getting shot," one screamed, not even waiting for me to obey him as he pulled my hands into the small of my back and placed them in cuffs. "Get the bloody light on, Reg," he said to the other policeman, pulling me up onto my knees and telling me to stay put. So I'm up on my knees, facing the door of my flat, with the other officer keeping his back against the door, drawing it open. I can see that there is another pair of police officers who have been banging on the door of the flat across the hall, only there's no reply from inside. No one comes to open the door. So up comes this other policeman with one of those door basher things. I don't know the proper name, only that one of the police called it the big key. They smashed their way into the door, screaming as they went. I figured they'd start dragging out whoever was in there, or at least being as aggressive as they were with me. But bizarrely, it was almost the opposite tone. It was verging on kind and caring, and I listened in confusion as they asked the person, "Are you all right? Do you know where you are? Can you hear me?" It was a minute or so later I watched in absolute horror as one officer walked out of the flat carrying a girl who couldn't have been any older than a teenager. She was barely dressed, covered in bruises, and her hair was a greasy mess that was plastered to her scalp. I looked up at one of the officers, a look of pure shock and revulsion on my face. "Let me guess, you didn't know anything about it. Why don't you just save it for the interview?" he says. But I didn't. I swear to God I didn't. And I told the police who questioned me down at the station the exact thing when they asked me all sorts of things about human trafficking rings. I broke down in tears when they tried to get me to admit that I was the ringleader or something, and swore blind that I had no idea what they were talking about, and that I'd never do anything like that, and that I just didn't have it in me. Eventually, they let me go, satisfied that I didn't have anything to do with it, but I was horrified that something like that couldn't have been going on right under my nose, that I'd smiled and joked with some of the scumbags that I'd frequented that flat, completely unaware of the hellishly cruel things they'd been getting up to inside of it. I ended up moving back in with my mom and dad not long after. I just couldn't live in that place anymore, and I couldn't cope with looking for a new place, not with the intense paranoia of not knowing what was going on behind the closed doors all around me. So please, as much as it might go against all of your F the police mentalities, just call the police if you think something weird is happening like that near you, because it is our business. It's all of our business, and that decision might be the difference between someone's freedom and an existence of pure torture. I'm from a city in the northwest of my country called Garanuns. It is a very beautiful place. Some call it the City of Flowers. I love Garanuns, but I cannot live there anymore. There are too many bad memories for me, and people accuse me of something which I am innocent of. You see, 8 years ago I lived next to a family called the Negromontes. They seemed like very nice people, but they did not have a lot of money since the man of the house, Jorge, could not find a job for some reason. It was spoken in our neighborhood that Jorge could not work because of an illness he had, but he had helped support his family by making and selling pastries to his neighbors, including myself. Jorge made the best empadas and salgados, which are traditional Brazilian pastries that we all love to eat, and on more than one occasion, I found him knocking at my door with a tray of delicious empadas for sale. They were very affordable and very delicious, and I know I am not the only one in our neighborhood who used to buy them very regularly from him. It felt good to be able to help him support his family like that. Some people said Jorge was mentally ill, but it seemed obviously to be that he had some kind of physical condition too. Sometimes, when Jorge called over at my apartment, he would burst out laughing for no reason at all, like he had heard someone tell a funny joke that only he could hear. Sometimes his arms seemed to shake when he held out the tray of empadas for me to look at, and one day he started having a nosebleed which dripped all over the pastries. He apologized a lot and seemed very nervous as he walked away from my door, but when I assured him it was okay and that I hoped that he would feel better soon, he broke into this high-pitched laughter as he disappeared around a corner. Jorge could act very strange like that, but I just felt sorry for him and kind of admired how determined he was to support his family like that by working hard at making delicious food. But one day, I came home from my job to see a few police cars outside the Negromonte house. All of the neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was going on, and we were shocked when a forensics team showed up too. These are the police who wear the white overalls and masks, the ones who look for pieces of dead bodies when there had been a murder. There were many rumors about what the family had been doing, but we did not have to wait long to find out what was going on. The pictures were all over the newspapers one day, and everyone heard the story being told on the local radio and TV stations. Human remains had been found in the family's backyard, and they were identified as belonging to a local homeless girl named Jessica, who had gone missing some time before. The news reports told us that the Negromontes had apparently lured her into the house with lies that they were looking for a nanny to look after their young child, but had then killed her and buried it in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time went on, even more disturbing facts were made public regarding the murders. I remember the day that the police had a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They claimed to have found a 50-page book that had been written by Jorge that he had titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. The book was all about how he claimed to have been hearing voices talking in his head about how he should kill women, how what he did was all part of some kind of terrible satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce its population. I found this to be extremely disturbing and upsetting, as I would never have imagined that Jorge could ever think like this. He always seemed like such a sweet person, but I guess I was wrong to think that. But somehow, as the weeks went by, we heard things that were somehow even worse, things that destroyed my life as I knew it. Forensics teams had analyzed the entire Negromonte house and discovered traces of the murdered woman's body tissue on cooking utensils used by the family. What's more, rather large chunks of flesh had been found to be missing from the bodies most recently buried in their backyard. Police could only come to one conclusion, that the family had been butchering the murdered women before cooking and eating their flesh. But what's more, rumors began to spread that not only had the family been practicing cannibalism, but they had actually sold some of the meat to the neighboring community in their empadas and salgados. It was horrifying to learn, as, of course, I had bought Jorge's pastries from him many times before, and not only had I eaten them, I thought they were very tasty. I remember sitting on my couch watching the TV when I heard the news. The room began to spin. I felt numb for a few moments, unable to properly compute the information that I had just heard, until it all became clear to me in one single horrible moment. I had eaten human flesh without my knowledge. I ran to the toilet and was violently sick. This was all traumatizing enough for me, but then rumors began to spread that the whole community was part of some satanic cult, and that we actually knew that we were eating it. People from all over the city came to our neighborhood to harass the people living there, including myself. Despite our denials, they called us all cannibals and told us that we were no longer welcome to live in Garanuns. I personally had a note posted through my door from someone anonymous telling me that I would be killed in revenge if I did not leave the city. I didn't want to risk my life, so I left for the coastal city very far away from Garanuns, where I currently live alone. I don't eat meat anymore. I am purely vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories for me and makes me instantly sick every time I taste it. So, now you understand why I don't wish to give my name or give too much information as to where I live, as I'm afraid I'll be hunted by these people seeking vengeance for Jorge Negromonte's terrible crimes. But I swear to Jesus Christ I did not know what I was eating, and if I ever did, I would not have eaten it, and I would have reported Jorge to the police. So please, although you think you might know who your neighbors are, ask yourself, do I really know who I'm living next to? Do I really know what they're doing behind closed doors? Because for some of us, we don't know exactly who our neighbors are, not until it's far too late. The whole sad mess started in May of 2011. I've been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of and incredibly lonely. So when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, our talks became more personal and I less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out, and I agreed. I was still a poor student, but even with that, our dinner went well and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if though I was trying to be a father to him, more of a friend, really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it may bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. Things really hit the fan when her ex-husband arrived unannounced at her house. I wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time, I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way to not get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed, but if you try to be the hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time her and her son lived there, no words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after and stayed until they moved out. A few times her and I would share a passing look, her eyes projecting an air of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move in, just as she had. Many times more I would witness the abuse, and at least once she knew I had. No one was going to save her but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened than a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was the last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feeling of loss I carry with me, the truth is she was always too good for me. An unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least, that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was, it was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family was a little odd. They do very unsafe things like chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally the stars never struck one of them, except for this one time when the girl threw one at her younger brother and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while, I thought it was because they were half Japanese and that's just what they did, but as I grew up, I realized that they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around. I'm not sure how it happened. One day I was hanging out at their house and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after, we happened to be wrestling around with each other and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days, we'd only touch one another's bodies, and some days, it went all the way. We'd been doing our best to hide what we were doing, but one day, her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her on how he found out, but he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me, I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion, so I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment. It was clearly working. I stopped to turn to look and see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it. Again. I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about what I'd been doing or even admitting I had those type of thoughts scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me. So I told her I was very thirsty and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure she believed me, but let it go and I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I'd never go over there again, as long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened until I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little harder to mess around at my place. My folks were always around. At least one of them. I was kind of mad she didn't stick up for me and obviously still shaken from nearly dying, but she was able to take my mind off of all of that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things and we continued messing around any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step 1 foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits at holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong and I expected him to chuck a knife at me any second. Back when I was a law student at a prominent London university, I moved into a shared house in Peckham during the final years of my studies. Half the reason I was so keen on that particular house was that only one of the other apartments was occupied. The trouble with being in a student house is that they tend to be pretty rowdy places. You never know quite when someone is going to bring home a bunch of friends from a club night and spend the wee small hours blasting music in the kitchen or whatever. Obviously, that's not conducive for a good sleeping pattern, and the last thing I wanted was to mess up my important final year by living in some bloody party house. So with the help of some close friends, I moved all my stuff into the flat one morning, with every intention of going upstairs to greet the person that lived on the top floor, and the only other person living in the house. But at one point, as I'm moving some bags up the stairs, I looked up the stairwell and saw someone looking down at me, with a cold, dull expression on their face. It was a guy, a rather tall one too, with short, cropped blonde hair and very, very pale blue eyes. I mean, they were so pale it was like they shined out of his eye sockets at me, this rather alarming shade of icy blue. I said hi to him in as friendly a way as I could muster, but instead of returning my greeting, he just stared at me for a few moments before slowly backing away from the stairwell. Then I just heard a door slam as he disappeared back into his apartment. The person I was with just kind of gave me an awkward, amused look as we whispered our hopes that he wouldn't end up being a weirdo or anything like that. God, when I look back on it, it was such a hauntingly prophetic moment. If only we knew how right we were. The first few nights were nothing unusual, and I was actually relieved that I get the peace and quiet that I've been hoping for. That was until one evening when I'm sitting in my computer chair and doing some research on international trade law, and I heard something coming from the hallway outside. At first it didn't bother me too much, and I simply put on some ambient music that always seemed to help me concentrate and tried to ignore the sounds coming from outside. But as the night went on, they seemed to get louder and louder, and eventually I couldn't contain my curiosity, walking over to the door so I could get an idea of exactly what they were. It was the sound of screaming in particular, a woman screaming, and it was coming from the apartment upstairs. At first I thought the guy up there was just watching a horror movie or something, and that's what the screaming sound was from. But the longer I listened, the more I realized that whoever was up there was listening to that and only that, like to the point I could hear the audio file or whatever looping at a certain time. He was just up there, listening to the sound of a woman screaming in pain for like an hour straight. I know I should have just gone up there and asked him to turn it down, but the idea that he was just sitting in his apartment listening to the sound of a woman screaming for that length of time, my God, it scared the life out of me. It was hours before I was silent again. I'm talking like 1 in the morning before I could finally even think about getting to sleep. Questions were rolling around my mind as I was lying there in the dark. Like, what kind of person just listens to stuff like that for hours at a time? Or worse, what if he was watching something criminally violent? What if he was up there watching some kind of snuff film? I lay awake for hours, absolutely terrified of my new situation, one I couldn't just escape from so easily since I'd spent such a huge amount of money on the admin charges, first month's rent, and that sort of thing. I was so bloody worried, and it was with those thoughts echoing through my mind that I finally drifted off to sleep. I was absolutely exhausted during lectures the next day, to the point where my mates were asking me if everything was okay, since apparently I looked as rough as a bear. I told them I was fine, but that something was seriously weird about the bloke who lived upstairs. A few of them consoled me with tales of their own weirdo housemates, and that, as creepy as he seemed to be, at least he wasn't a perv who was constantly trying to get in my pants or whatever. And I suppose that, in a manner of speaking, they were right. But that night I just found myself getting pretty angry that this guy was so bloody inconsiderate, so I put on my big girl pants and marched up to his apartment with every intention of getting him to turn the volume down. So I rock up to his door, knocking on it loudly as I wait for him to answer. Little side note, I've dealt with noisy neighbors before. Usually the moment you knock, the noise turns down. They're embarrassed, apologetic, generally reasonable people. Only with this guy, the noises didn't turn down at all. I can't even describe how unnerving it was to hear what was coming from inside that apartment. I still don't know what those screaming sounds were from, be it a movie or a weird noisecore album or some other bollocks, but I'm telling you now, they sounded real. They were utterly blood-curdling, the kind of screams you only get out of someone when they know they're about to die. I was positively shaking with fear by the time I heard the door begin to unlock, and when it opened, what I saw was more unnerving than I could possibly imagine. The weird blonde guy that I had seen looking down the stairwell at me just a week or so before, well, I assume it was him anyway, was wearing a mask, one that I find hard to describe when I think about it. It was made of varnished wood, I know that, and it looked kind of like a death mask, like the cast of a person's face that's made when they've recently passed away. Only there was something horribly, horribly wrong with this mask. Something that sounds deeply unnerving. It was misshapen, warped, with indistinguishable words or symbols carved into it. But that's not what really freaked me out, because when he opened the door, he was also completely and utterly stark naked. I remember backing up on the spot, putting a bit of a distance between myself and the masked man before I asked him, in the politest way imaginable, if he would be so kind as to turn the music down just a little bit. He didn't even move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring back at me from the eye slits that had been cut into the mask. I just kept backing up, shifting my tone from polite request to outright apologetic that I'd been so rude as to disturb him. But still he didn't move. He didn't make a sound, he just carried on, staring at me. By the time I saw the scars that ran up and down his chest, I just ran back downstairs into my apartment and locked the door behind me, almost hyperventilating with fright as I called a friend who lived nearby and asked if I could stay at their place for a while. They were curious as to why I was so upset, and especially as to why I suddenly didn't want to stay at the flat that I'd previously been so made up with. But once I explained, they invited me around immediately and told me to stay as long as I wanted. From there, I contacted the police and made an indecent exposure complaint, but the officer I spoke to said that without any witnesses, it would be essentially my word against theirs and it was nothing to build a case on. They recommended that, as inconvenient and disappointing as it was, that it was best that I just stay away from this disturbed, masked neighbor person as much as possible. I ended up moving out of that flat as quickly as I could, going back with a few friends during the daytime to collect my things, and once again, the guy upstairs watching from up the stairwell, just staring again, completely emotionless. After that, I started to realize why the rest of the flats remained empty. I ended up graduating with a first in my law degree, and now I help run a law firm in the city of Birmingham. I remember my time in London well, but I tried never to think about that empty apartment building, ever, again.